In this video, we'll explore 5 extraordinary cases where condemned prisoners walked away from death row, not because they were proven innocent, but because governors made the difficult decision to show mercy. These are stories of last-minute phone calls, international campaigns, and the complex moral questions that arise when the state holds the power over life and death. Welcome to Deadline Files. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means a great deal, and it keeps these important stories alive. Paula Cooper, the youngest on death row. Our first case takes us back to May 1985 in Gary, Indiana, where a tragedy would unfold that would shock the nation and spark international controversy. Paula Cooper was just 15 years old when she and 3 friends made a decision that would change their lives forever. They skipped school, got high, and decided to commit robbery. Their target was 78-year-old Ruth Pelka, a Bible studies teacher who made the fatal mistake of welcoming the girls into her home. What happened next was unthinkable. Paula Cooper stabbed Mrs. Pelka 33 times with a 12-inch butcher knife. The girls fled with only $10 and an old car, a pathetic haul for such a horrific crime. When Cooper confessed the killing, she was just 16 years old at her trial in 1986. Despite her youth, Indiana law at the time was shockingly harsh, allowing the death penalty for offenders as young as 10 years old. The judge sentenced her to death, making Paula Cooper the youngest person on death row in America. But something remarkable happened that would transform this case from a simple tale of justice into something far more complex. Bill Pelka, Ruth's grandson, did something almost unimaginable. He forgave Paula Cooper. Not only that, but he became one of her most vocal supporters, believing his devout Christian grandmother would not have wanted a 16-year-old girl executed in her name. The international response was unprecedented. Pope John Paul II personally appealed for clemency. An Italian priest collected over 2 million petition signatures from Europeans urging that Paula be spared. The case became a symbol of what many saw as American capital punishment excesses, executing children for crimes committed in their youth. Legal change came in 1988 when the U.S. Supreme Court banned executions for offenders under 16 at the time of their crime. The Indiana Supreme Court vacated Paula's death sentence in 1989 and ordered her to serve 60 years in prison instead. Behind bars, Paula transformed herself completely. She earned a bachelor's degree and became a model inmate, even trained service dogs as part of her rehabilitation program, proving that even those who commit terrible crimes as children can change. After serving nearly 28 years, she was released on parole on June 17, 2013, at age 43. Her release was widely covered in the media. She walked out of the Rockville Correctional Facility in Indiana into a world that had followed her case for decades. She expressed deep remorse for her crime and gratitude for the second chance at life. Bill Pelka was there to greet her as a friend. Tragically, freedom proved more challenging than prison. On May 26, 2015, just 2 years after her release, Paula Cooper died by suicide in Indianapolis. She was found dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound at age 45, struggling to adjust to life outside prison walls and haunted by guilt over the crime that had defined her entire life. Ruth Pelka's family, while forever saddened by the loss, stood as an example of forgiveness, and Paula's short post-prison life stands as a poignant coda to a very consequential case. Henry Lee Lucas, the serial killer who maybe wasn't. In the 1980s, Henry Lee Lucas gained infamy as a self-proclaimed serial killer who confessed to hundreds of murders across the United States. His claims were so extensive and detailed that law enforcement agencies nationwide began clearing cold cases based on his confessions. Among these was the 1979 murder of an unidentified young woman in Texas, known only as orange socks for the only garment she wore when found. The victim had been raped and strangled. The orange socks victim remained unidentified for decades. She was finally identified in 2019 as Deborah Jackson. In 1984, Lucas was convicted of that murder and sentenced to death in Texas. However, as journalists and investigators dug deeper into Lucas's claims, significant doubts began to emerge about whether he had actually killed the victim, or many of the other people he claimed to have murdered. Lucas was a pathological liar with a troubled past, and investigative journalists found that many of his detailed confessions couldn't possibly be true. In several instances, Lucas was proven to be in different states when murders he confessed to occurred. The man who claimed to be one of America's most prolific serial killers was beginning to look more like one of its most prolific liars. In the Orange Socks case specifically, work records and a cashed paycheck indicated that Lucas was very likely in Florida on October 31, 1979, the exact day the woman was murdered in Texas. Lucas eventually recanted his confession, claiming he had falsely confessed under pressure from overzealous investigators eager to close cases. By the 1990s, journalists and even Texas Rangers had discovered the implausibility of many of his confessions. The case reached the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles for Clemency review in 1998, when George W. Bush was governor. On June 26, 1998, in a highly unusual move for Texas, a state known for its aggressive use of capital punishment, the board unanimously recommended clemency for Henry Lee Lucas. Governor Bush accepted the recommendation and commuted Lucas's death sentence to life in prison, citing lingering doubts about Lucas's guilt. Bush stated, "The first question I ask in each death penalty case is whether there is any doubt about the individual's guilt. While Henry Lee Lucas is guilty of committing a number of horrible crimes, serious concerns have been raised about his guilt in this case." This was the only time Governor Bush ever spared a condemned prisoner's life during his entire tenure. Henry Lee Lucas did not live many years beyond his commutation. 3 years later, on March 13, 2001, Lucas died of natural causes, heart failure. In prison, while serving multiple life sentences for other murders he unquestionably committed. Kenneth Foster Jr., the getaway driver. On August 15, 1996, 19-year-old Kenneth Foster Jr. was behind the wheel when his friend Mauricio Brown made a decision that would put both their lives in jeopardy. Brown shot and killed 25-year-old Michael LaHood Jr. in the driveway of his San Antonio, Texas home, while Foster remained in the car about 80 feet away. Foster was the getaway driver that night. He was driving Brown and 2 others around committing robberies when Brown got out of the car and confronted LaHood, ultimately shooting him. Foster never pulled the trigger, never intended for anyone to die, but under Texas law, that didn't matter. Under Texas's controversial law of parties, prosecutors held Foster legally accountable for the murder, as if he had committed it himself. The state argued that Foster should have anticipated that Brown might commit murder during their crime spree, making Foster equally culpable for the death. In 1997, Foster was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death, the same punishment as the actual shooter, Brown. It was a harsh application of a law that many would later question. The irony was stark. Brown, the man who actually pulled the trigger, was executed in 2006, while Foster continued to await the same fate for his role as an accessory. Foster spent about a decade on death row in Texas, 1997 to 2007, during his appeals. His case became increasingly controversial, as even some of the jurors who sentenced him later expressed unease that Texas law permitted a death sentence for a getaway driver who hadn't intended or directly caused the killing. Foster had no prior violent criminal record, making his death sentence seem even more extreme to critics. By 2007, Foster's execution date was set for August 30th. As the date approached, his family, activists, and even some Texas lawmakers rallied for clemency. Amnesty International issued urgent appeals, arguing that executing someone who didn't actually kill anyone violated basic human rights standards. The clock was ticking, and it seemed Foster would meet the same fate as his friend Brown. But just hours before Foster was to be led to the execution chamber, something extraordinary happened. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 6-1 to recommend clemency to Governor Rick Perry. This was extraordinarily rare, as the board almost never advised clemency in death penalty cases. Governor Perry accepted the recommendation on August 30, 2007, saying he was concerned about Texas law that allowed multiple defendants to be tried together for capital murder. He highlighted the troubling fact that Foster hadn't fired the gun, yet faced the ultimate punishment. This was the first time Governor Perry had ever granted clemency to a death row inmate during his long tenure. Foster is now serving a life sentence and became eligible for parole after 40 years, meaning the earliest he could potentially be released would be in the mid-2030s. Now in his mid-40s, Foster has spent over 25 years behind bars. He has stayed active as a writer, even publishing poetry from prison reflecting on justice and confinement. Gaile Owens, the battered wife. In 1985, Gaile Owens was living what appeared to be a suburban dream in Memphis, Tennessee, a mother of two, with a husband and a comfortable home. But behind closed doors, her life was a nightmare of abuse and violence. On February 17, 1985, that nightmare reached its climax when Ronald Owens was brutally beaten to death with a tire iron at the couple's home. The shocking truth was that Gaile had hired a stranger named Sidney Porterfield to kill her husband. It seemed like a clear-cut case of murder for hire, and initially, the legal system treated it as such. The motive, as presented by prosecutors, was financial gain, a life insurance policy, and relief from an unhappy marriage. The case took a dramatic turn when Gaile agreed to a plea bargain for life in prison, hoping to avoid the death penalty. However, that deal fell apart because her co-defendant, Porterfield, refused his own negotiated plea. With the co-defendant insisting on going to trial, the state withdrew Gaile's deal and decided to seek the death penalty after all. Years later, a more complete picture emerged of what had driven Gaile to such desperate measures. Evidence surfaced that she had been subjected to severe domestic abuse by Ronald, including physical and sexual assaults that had made her life unbearable. At her 1986 trial, however, this abuse wasn't fully presented as evidence. Gaile made a fateful decision. She chose not to use a battered wife defense out of shame and to protect her sons from knowing the horrific details of what their father had done to their mother. It was a decision that may have cost her life. In 1986, Gaile was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, becoming one of the very few women on death row in the United States. Her sentence was particularly controversial because she had originally accepted a plea for life imprisonment but still ended up facing execution due to circumstances beyond her control. Gaile Owens's appeals highlighted several mitigating factors: her history as a battered spouse, her mental state, and the alleged unfairness of how her plea deal was handled, essentially arguing that prosecutors punished her with death for her co-defendant's refusal to plead. These arguments initially did not sway the courts. As her 2010 execution date approached, her situation drew widespread attention. In a powerful show of forgiveness, Owens's two now adult sons publicly forgave their mother and pleaded for her life to be spared. Women's advocacy groups rallied to her cause, and even some of the jurors who had originally sentenced her came forward to support clemency, now understanding the full context of her crime. The case became, in the media, a symbol of potential injustice, the notion that this is not the kind of case the death penalty was meant for. In July 2010, the Tennessee board voted 4-3 to recommend clemency, a close decision that reflected the complexity of the case. On July 14, 2010, Governor Phil Bredesen commuted Gaile's death sentence to life in prison. Bredesen noted that prosecutors had originally agreed not to seek the death penalty if Owens pleaded guilty, but then went back on that agreement when circumstances changed. In his view, Owens ended up on death row due to procedural fate, rather than the heinousness of her crime alone. In October 2011, after 26 years behind bars, she was released on parole at age 58. Gaile Owens passed away peacefully in 2022 at age 67, having spent her final years as a free woman. Julius Jones, 4 hours from execution. Our final case is the most recent and perhaps the most dramatic in terms of timing. In July 1999, 45-year-old Paul Howell, a businessman in Edmond, Oklahoma, was shot and killed in his driveway during a carjacking. Julius Jones, then just 19 years old, was arrested and charged with Howell's murder in a case that would consume the next 2 decades of his life. The case against Jones was built primarily on a co-defendant's testimony and circumstantial evidence, not the strongest foundation for a death penalty conviction. Howell's stolen SUV was linked to Jones and his friends, and a gun wrapped in a bandana, allegedly used in the crime, was found in Jones's family home. Jones maintained his innocence from the beginning, insisting he was at home with his family at the time of the murder and claiming that his co-defendant, Christopher Jordan, had framed him to save himself. The prosecution's case had significant weaknesses. The only eyewitness, Howell's sister, couldn't positively identify Jones as the shooter. The shooter face was covered and much of the evidence was indirect. Despite these issues, Jones was convicted and sentenced to death in 2002. Jones spent roughly 20 years on Oklahoma's death row, during which time his appellate lawyers argued multiple grounds for overturning his conviction: racial bias in jury selection, ineffective assistance of counsel, and prosecutorial misconduct. Perhaps most compelling, 3 jailhouse informants signed affidavits saying they had heard Christopher Jordan confess to the killing and admit to framing Jones. Jones's case gradually drew national and international attention, particularly after being featured in a 2018 ABC documentary series. Celebrities and activists took up his cause, believing he was wrongfully convicted. Despite the growing publicity and support, his appeals were largely unsuccessful through the courts, and by fall 2021, he had exhausted most standard legal remedies. An execution date was set for November 18, 2021, and it appeared that Julius Jones would finally meet his fate. But as the date approached, public pressure mounted. The Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board held hearings, and in a crucial vote, decided 3-1 in favor of commuting his death sentence to life in prison, citing doubts about Jones's guilt. The final decision rested with Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt. As the hours ticked away on November 18th, Stitt met with both Jones's attorneys and the victim's family, weighing arguments on both sides. The clock was running out. Jones was scheduled to die that very day. Finally, on November 18th, 2021, just 4 hours before the scheduled execution, Governor Stitt granted clemency, commuting Julius Jones's sentence to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. It was a decision that came so close to the execution time that it resembled something from a Hollywood thriller rather than real life. In his public statement, Governor Stitt said he made the decision after prayerful consideration of all sides. It was only the 5th death row clemency granted in Oklahoma since the state resumed executions in 1976. These 5 cases illustrate the profound moral and legal complexities surrounding capital punishment in America. Whether driven by doubts about guilt, concerns about fairness, or simple acts of mercy, These commutations remind us that the death penalty system, administered by fallible human beings, cannot claim perfection. From Paula Cooper, the youngest person ever sentenced to death row, who found redemption behind bars, but struggled with the weight of freedom, to Julius Jones, spared with just hours to live. These stories demonstrate that sometimes the most difficult decisions require choosing compassion over vengeance, mercy over retribution. Each case raises different questions. Should age matter in capital cases? What happens when the evidence isn't as solid as it first appeared? Is it just to execute someone who didn't pull the trigger? Can domestic abuse justify murder? And how do we handle cases where doubt lingers about guilt itself? These stories don't provide easy answers, but they do show us something important. That in a system dealing with the ultimate punishment, there must always be room for second thoughts, for mercy, and for the recognition that human judgment, like humanity itself, is imperfect. The power to commute a death sentence represents one of the last checks in our system against irreversible error or injustice. In these 5 cases, that power was used to spare lives, sometimes at the very last moment. Whether you agree with these decisions or not, they remind us that in matters of life and death, the stakes could not be higher.